The email notification blinked on her screen just as she was finalizing the numbers for the quarter's biggest deal. Clara's fingers froze over the keyboard, her heart thumping in her chest as she read the subject line, "Immediate termination notice." The office hummed around her with its usual mid-morning energy, but suddenly it felt like someone had turned up the volume on everything. The clicking of keyboards, the muffled phone conversations, the rustling of papers, all of it pressing against her ears. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the message. It wasn't lengthy, nor did it offer much explanation beyond corporate jargon about restructuring and performance reviews that didn't align with company goals. At the bottom was a signature she barely recognized, Alexander Reed, CEO. The new guy who had only been at the helm for 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which Clara hadn't even crossed paths with him once. Clara leaned back in her chair, staring at the words until they blurred together. She'd spent 6 years building this career, climbing from an entry-level position to become one of the most trusted negotiators in the firm. Her name wasn't just known within these walls, clients requested her specifically when deals were on the table. And now, without warning, without so much as a conversation, she was being pushed out like yesterday's news. She glanced around the office, trying to steady herself. People were oblivious, heads down, focused on their tasks. But Clara knew better. Word would spread quickly. By lunchtime, everyone would know. The thought made her stomach churn. The irony hit her hard. Just last week, she'd closed a multi-million-dollar partnership with Technova Industries, a deal that had taken months of relentless effort and countless late nights. That same deal was likely what kept this sinking ship afloat. Yet here she was, fired by someone who probably didn't even realize how crucial she'd been to keeping the company relevant. Clara grabbed her bag from under her desk, stuffing her personal belongings inside with mechanical precision. A framed photo of her younger brother smiled up at her before disappearing into the tote. She couldn't stay here another second. Not today. Not after this. As she stepped into the elevator, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on her shoulders. The doors slid shut, sealing her off from the world she'd poured so much of herself into. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes and breathe deeply, trying to calm the storm raging inside her. But the questions came anyway, swirling uncontrollably through her mind. What had she done wrong? Why hadn't anyone fought for her? And most importantly, how could the new CEO not see what everyone else seemed to understand, that Clara was indispensable? When the elevator dinged open at the lobby, she forced herself to walk steadily toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she refused to let anyone see her falter. Outside, the city buzzed with life, indifferent to her turmoil. Cars honked, people hurried past, and the sun shone brightly overhead, mocking her with its cheerfulness. Clara found herself sitting on a bench in the small park across the street, clutching her bag tightly against her chest. The wind tugged at strands of her dark hair, but she barely noticed. Instead, her thoughts drifted back to the day she'd first walked into those offices, fresh-faced and eager to prove herself. 6 years ago, she'd been nothing more than a recent graduate hoping to make her mark. Now she was, what? Unemployed? Forgotten? Replaced? No. She shook her head firmly, pushing the self-pity aside. She wouldn't let this define her. Whatever happened next, she would face it head-on. But first, she needed answers. Answers only Alexander Reed could provide. Clara had always prided herself on her ability to adapt, to find solutions where others saw dead ends. It was this resilience that had earned her a reputation as a problem solver, both in her professional life and among her close-knit circle of friends. But as she sat on that park bench, staring blankly at the fountain in front of her, she realized something unsettling. She didn't feel resilient right now. She felt broken. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her bag, pulling her momentarily from her thoughts. Without looking, she knew it was messages from colleagues, perhaps even a few concerned texts from friends who'd already heard the news. She ignored them all. Right now, she couldn't bear the thought of explaining herself or pretending to be okay when she wasn't. Instead, she let her mind wander back to some of her greatest victories at the company, the moments that had defined her career and solidified her place in the industry. There was the time she'd single-handedly salvaged a deal with Green Tech Enterprises after their lead negotiator abruptly quit mid-conversation. Clara had stepped in, armed with nothing but her wits and a hastily scribbled outline, and managed to secure terms that exceeded expectations. Or the night she'd stayed up until 3 a.m., drafting a proposal for a tech startup that eventually became one of their flagship clients. Those wins weren't just milestones, they were proof of her worth. Proof that should have mattered. But none of it seemed to matter to Alexander Reed. Who was he, anyway? Clara racked her brain, trying to recall anything substantial about the man who had effectively ended her career with a single email. All she could remember was his introduction meeting, a slick PowerPoint presentation filled with buzzwords like innovation, streamlining, and synergy. He'd spoken confidently, exuding charm and authority, but there had been no real substance. No acknowledgement of the people in the room who had spent years keeping the company afloat. And yet somehow, he had convinced the board to hand him the reins. Clara gritted her teeth at the memory. She hated feeling powerless, especially when she knew she deserved better. But anger alone wouldn't fix this. If she wanted answers, and if she wanted justice, she needed to think strategically. By the time evening rolled around, Clara had formulated a plan. First, she would reach out to her network. Over the years, she'd built strong relationships with key players in the industry, many of whom owed her favors or respected her work. They might not be able to reverse her termination, but they could offer guidance, or at least moral support. Second, she would request a meeting with Alexander Reed. Not tomorrow, not when emotions were still raw, but soon enough to ensure he couldn't dismiss her outright. She would demand an explanation face to face, and make sure he understood exactly what he'd lost by letting her go. Finally, she would start preparing for whatever came next. Whether that meant finding a new job or striking out on her own, she refused to let this setback derail her completely. After all, adversity often revealed hidden opportunities, if you were brave enough to look for them. As dusk settled over the city, Clara stood from the bench, brushing off imaginary dust from her blazer. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. For the first time since opening that email, she felt a flicker of determination ignite within her. This wasn't the end of her story, it was merely a chapter she hadn't anticipated. And Clara was ready to write the next one. The following morning, Clara woke with a clarity she hadn't expected. Sleep had eluded her for most of the night, her mind racing with scenarios and strategies, but when dawn broke, she felt oddly resolved. Today, she decided, would be about taking control, not just of her narrative, but of her future. Her first move was reaching out to Marcus, a former colleague who now worked as a senior consultant at a rival firm. They'd always maintained a friendly rapport, often exchanging insights over coffee or industry events. Marcus had witnessed firsthand Clara's knack for closing high-stakes deals, and she trusted him to give her honest feedback. When he picked up on the second ring, his voice was warm but cautious. "Clara? Hey, I heard about what happened. Are you okay?" His tone carried genuine concern, which caught her off guard for a moment. She hadn't realized word traveled so fast. "I'm fine," she said firmly, though her throat tightened slightly. "Look, Marcus, I need your perspective. Do you think I should try to salvage something here, or is it smarter to cut my losses and move on?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Honestly, both options have merit, but knowing you, I doubt you'll walk away without understanding why this happened. Have you considered talking to Reed directly?" Clara sighed. "That's exactly what I'm planning to do. But I want to make sure I'm not wasting my time. What do you know about him? Anything useful?" Marcus chuckled dryly. "Useful? Maybe. Flattering? Not really. From what I've gathered, Reed's big on optics. He likes making bold moves to impress the board, even if those moves don't necessarily benefit the company long term. Some say he's more interested in headlines than actual results." This aligned with Clara's initial impression of him, but hearing it confirmed stung nonetheless. "So you're saying he fired me because it looked good on paper? Because I didn't fit into whatever image he's trying to project?" "It's possible," Marcus admitted. "But don't underestimate yourself, Clara. You've got skills and connections most people in this industry would kill for. If Reed doesn't see that, someone else will." His words bolstered her confidence, even as they underscored the absurdity of her situation. After thanking him, Clara hung up and scrolled through her contacts, sending quick messages to a handful of trusted allies. Their responses trickled in throughout the day, each one offering encouragement, advice, or potential leads. One friend mentioned a startup looking for a seasoned negotiator, another suggested she consider freelancing, citing her extensive client list as leverage. Every message reminded her that she wasn't alone, and that her value extended far beyond the confines of her old office. By late afternoon, Clara felt ready to tackle the next phase of her plan, confronting Alexander Reed. She drafted a concise email requesting a meeting, framing it as a professional courtesy rather than a plea for reconsideration. "I believe transparency is essential for mutual understanding," she wrote, careful to keep her tone neutral. "Given the circumstances surrounding my departure, I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss further." She hit send and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Now all she could do was wait. In the meantime, she allowed herself to reflect on the broader implications of her predicament. Being fired wasn't just a blow to her ego, it challenged her identity. For years, Clara had defined herself by her work, pouring every ounce of passion and energy into excelling at her job. Losing that anchor left her feeling untethered, unsure of who she was outside of the corporate world. Was she still the same person without the title, the corner office, the prestige? The question lingered uncomfortably in her mind as she wandered aimlessly through her apartment. She stopped in front of a mirror, studying her reflection critically. The woman staring back at her looked tired, yes, but also resolute. Beneath the exhaustion was a spark of defiance, a reminder that she was more than the sum of her achievements. Clara turned away from the mirror and opened her laptop, pulling up files she hadn't touched in months. Resumes, cover letters, notes from networking events, all remnants of earlier chapters in her life. As she sifted through them, an idea began to form. What if this wasn't just about finding a new job? What if it was about creating something entirely her own? Her thoughts drifted to the countless times she'd mentored junior employees, helping them navigate tricky negotiations or develop pitches that dazzled clients. Teaching had always been a source of joy for her, albeit a secondary focus. Could she turn that passion into a full-fledged venture? Perhaps a consulting service tailored to young professionals entering the field? Or even workshops designed to empower women in male-dominated industries. The possibilities excited her, though they also terrified her. Starting something from scratch required courage and faith, qualities she wasn't sure she possessed in abundance right now. Still, the seed had been planted, and Clara found herself jotting down ideas feverishly, her pen flying across the page. It wasn't until hours later, as twilight bathed her apartment in soft hues, that she finally paused. Her notebook was filled with scribbles and sketches, each one representing a fragment of a dream she hadn't dared to entertain before. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would refine those fragments into something tangible. For now, she simply allowed herself to imagine a future where failure wasn't the end, but the beginning of something extraordinary. The reply from Alexander Reed arrived sooner than Clara expected. It was brief, almost curt. "We can meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please come prepared to discuss your concerns." No pleasantries, no acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. Just a directive, delivered with the same impersonal efficiency as the termination email. Clara stared at the message for a long moment, her jaw tightening. Prepared? She was more than prepared. She had spent years proving her worth, not just to her colleagues but to herself. And now, she intended to make sure Alexander Reed understood exactly what he'd thrown away. The next morning, she arrived at the office 15 minutes early, dressed impeccably in a navy blue blazer and tailored trousers. Her heels clicked against the marble floor of the lobby, echoing louder than usual in the quiet space. She half expected security to stop her. After all, she no longer belonged here, but no one questioned her presence. As she stepped into the elevator, she caught her reflection in the polished metal walls. Her expression was calm, composed, but there was steel in her eyes. She looked like someone who refused to be dismissed. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Clara took a deep breath and strode toward Reed's office. His assistant, a young woman with an air of nervous efficiency, greeted her hesitantly. "Mr. Reed will see you now," she said, gesturing toward the door. Clara nodded and pushed it open without hesitation. Alexander Reed sat behind a sleek glass desk, his suit impeccable, his posture rigid. He glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Bennett," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please sit." She did, setting her bag down beside her and folding her hands neatly in her lap. Up close, he looked younger than she remembered, mid-30s maybe, with sharp features and an aura of calculated confidence. But there was something hollow in his gaze, a detachment that unnerved her. He didn't seem like someone who truly understood the weight of his decisions. "You wanted to discuss your termination," he began, leaning back in his chair. I assume you have questions. Clara met his gaze squarely, refusing to let him intimidate her. Yes, I do. Starting with why. Your email mentioned restructuring and performance reviews, but frankly, Mr. Reed, that doesn't add up. In the past 6 months alone, I've secured 2 of the largest deals this company has seen in years. So forgive me if I find your reasoning insufficient. Reed's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't interrupt. Encouraged, Clara continued. Let's be clear, I'm not here asking for my job back. What I want is an explanation. Did you even review my contributions before making this decision? Or was this just another checkbox on your list of changes to implement? Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. For a moment, Reed seemed taken aback, as if he hadn't anticipated such directness. Then slowly, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Ms. Bennett, I understand your frustration. But running a business requires making tough decisions. Sometimes, those decisions aren't personal, they're strategic. Strategic, Clara repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. You mean cutting costs? Streamlining teams? Is that code for eliminating anyone who doesn't fit your vision, regardless of their value? He hesitated, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his polished facade. It's not about fitting a vision, he said carefully. It's about aligning with priorities. My priority is ensuring this company remains competitive in a rapidly changing market. And sometimes, that means reevaluating roles and responsibilities. Clara leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Interesting. Because from where I'm standing, firing your top negotiator doesn't sound like a move designed to boost competitiveness. If anything, it seems short-sighted. Reed's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he reached for a folder on his desk and slid it across to her. This outlines the rationale behind recent staffing adjustments. I won't apologize for doing what I believe is best for the company. However, I do regret any inconvenience caused. She flipped open the folder, skimming its contents. It was a generic overview of performance metrics and departmental goals, nothing specific to her case. Nothing that justified her dismissal. Closing it with a snap, she set it aside and fixed him with a steely glare. Inconvenience, she echoed, her tone icy. Is that how you see this? Because from my perspective, it feels more like negligence. Negligence to overlook the very people who keep this company afloat while chasing trends and flashy initiatives. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. But then it vanished, replaced by the same cold professionalism he'd worn since she entered the room. I appreciate your candor, Ms. Reed, he said, rising from his seat. If there's nothing else, I have another meeting shortly. Clara stood as well, smoothing her blazer with deliberate care. Just one more thing, she said, her voice steady. You may not realize it now, but you've made a mistake. A big one. And when the fallout hits, I hope you'll remember this conversation. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the office, her head held high. The encounter hadn't given her closure, but it had given her something else, confirmation that Alexander Reed didn't grasp the magnitude of what he'd done. And that knowledge? That was power. Back in her apartment later that evening, Clara replayed the meeting in her mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. Reed's indifference gnawed at her, fueling a fire she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about proving him wrong. Proving everyone wrong. With renewed determination, she pulled out her notebook and began sketching plans for her next move. Clara spent the next few weeks pouring her energy into building something entirely her own. She reached out to former colleagues, clients, and mentors, pitching an idea that had been brewing in her mind, a boutique consulting firm specializing in high-stakes negotiations and leadership training for women in business. To her surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People believed in her vision, and more importantly, they believed in her. Within 2 months, Clara launched Bennett Strategies, a sleek, modern brand that reflected her sharp expertise and unshakable determination. Her first client? Technova Industries, the very company whose deal she'd closed just before her termination. When their CEO heard about her new venture, he personally called to offer his support. You were indispensable then, he told her during their meeting. And I have no doubt you'll be even more so now. Word spread quickly. Soon, Clara was booking speaking engagements at industry conferences, hosting workshops, and landing contracts with some of the biggest names in tech and finance. Each success felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, and proving Alexander Reed wrong became less about vengeance and more about validation. One evening, as Clara reviewed quarterly projections for her growing team, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Marcus, her old colleague. Attached was a news article titled *Reads Reshuffle Backfires, Key Clients Walk Away Amid Leadership Shakeup. The piece detailed how several major accounts had pulled out after Clara's departure, citing her absence as a critical factor. According to insiders, Reed's credibility was crumbling under mounting pressure from the board. Clara smirked as she set her phone aside. Karma had a way of balancing things. Months later, while attending a networking event, Clara found herself face-to-face with none other than Alexander Reed. He looked different, less polished, more weary, but his expression softened when he saw her. "Ms. Bennett," he said, extending a hand. "Congratulations on your success. You've certainly made waves." "Thank you," Clara replied coolly, shaking his hand. "Though I imagine my success hasn't exactly been good news for you." Reed chuckled ruefully. "Let's just say hindsight is 20/20ths. If I could go back." "But you can't," Clara interrupted, her tone firm yet not unkind. "And honestly, I'm glad it happened this way. This path has given me opportunities one never would have pursued otherwise." As they parted ways, Clara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't defined by what Reed, or anyone else, thought of her. She was defined by resilience, ambition, and the courage to turn adversity into triumph. And as she walked away, surrounded by colleagues who admired her and clients who trusted her implicitly, she realized something beautiful. She didn't need closure anymore. She already had everything she needed: a thriving career, unwavering confidence, and a future brighter than ever before.